We'll start the book of Leviticus tonight. If you want to be turning your Bibles over there, if you're not already there. I was talking to somebody, actually texting somebody a couple weeks ago about what we were getting ready to study, and they threatened to stay home and watch Gunsmoke. I'm not going to say who that is, Dennis Douglas. If you've ever studied the book of Leviticus, it's not the most exciting book to study. And so we're going to be zipping through it, though. We've got 8 chapters that we want to try to cover tonight. Mainly going to deal with the different offerings that were present under the law of Moses, and then talk a little bit about the death of Aaron's 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu. Question number 1, though, on your handout, of course, thought question kind of involves these different offerings and something that's said about them, but personal question here, what kind of fragrances do you like best? What kind of fragrances smell best to you?
Sweet.
Okay, I knew women would have it nailed down. I mean, they've got these scents all throughout the home. They got these candles, that smell just the way they want them. As a man, the things that smell good to me are steak. That's what I mean. That was one that popped into my mind. Yeah. Anybody else?
The smell of drying hay.
Yeah. That's a good smell, isn't it? I even wrote down cedar. I like the smell of cedar. Honeysuckle's not my thing. And Miss Judy said honeysuckle, but to each their own, right? I like the smell of feed too. I don't know. I think guys have a little bit different smell than probably women do. But all of us have different types of fragrances that to us, they're appealing. They smell good. And it's interesting as you read through these first 8 chapters here of the book of Leviticus, there's 11 times in these 8 chapters that you read about a sweet aroma, God smelling a sweet aroma. Of course, it revolves around these different sacrifices that were being offered up to God. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. To think of the smells associated with the tabernacle as a sweet aroma, it would smell more to us like a slaughterhouse. But the reason that these things smelled good to God, of course, God put into the figure of a man to help us better understand Him. But it's what God wanted and what God had asked of the people. And whenever these sacrifices were offered up, then it did something to the sin of man. It rolled that sin forward, which was pleasing in the sight of God. And so it's interesting to read about these things and to read about how they were a sweet aroma to God. Okay, we're going to jump into chapter 1 here, and basically if you've read ahead, hopefully you've read some of these. Again, it's kind of monotonous as you go through them. But chapter 1 really deals with the idea of a burnt offering. And does anybody, what was unique about the burnt offering from the other offerings? Yeah, it was the only offering that was just completely, all of it was burned up. Other parts of it, you'll read about it. Parts were given to the priests, parts were used by the people. But this was really the only offering in which the whole thing was consumed. And when you go down, let's read verse 4 here, and let's talk a little bit about the purpose of the burnt offering. Somebody read Leviticus 1 and verse 4.
And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement of him.
Okay, so what was the purpose of a burnt offering? Yeah, atonement. Atonement, that's one of those words that we throw around and we read a lot, I guess, probably in the Bible, but I don't think we really stop to think about it that deeply or talk about it. Anybody know what does the word atonement mean?
Cover.
Yeah, just a really basic definition of the word, it means to cover. And it's kind of interesting when you look at it, and I know a lot of times it's talking about sacrifices and it's talking about sin, but it's also used in other places of the Bible. And, I like to look at these other places to kind of get a grasp on the meaning of the word itself to better understand it in the context of when it comes to the idea of covering sin. And one of the stories that you'll read about involves David and the Gibeonites. Anybody remember who the Gibeonites were?
They were the people who pretended to be from far away.
Yeah, whenever Joshua and the children of Israel were going in to conquer the promised land, remember they conquered two of the great kings. And these were actually people who were living in the land, but they pretended to be travelers from far away. And they came to Joshua and they said, we're from this faraway country. We've heard about all that your God did in Egypt, and now these two great kings that you've defeated. And we've come because our rulers want to make a covenant with you. Well, remember, they weren't supposed to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, but these guys, pretended to be not the inhabitants of the land, but from somewhere far away. And so, without consulting with God, Joshua makes a covenant. He and the leader of the children of Israel, they make a covenant with these Gibeonites, and the covenant was that they wouldn't kill them. And so, years later, whenever Saul became king, partly in his zeal to finish fulfilling the Lord's commands, he starts killing all these other peoples and nations that are still present in the land. Well, one of them was the Gibeonites. And when David becomes king, remember there's 3 years of famine that happens under David's rule, and he's trying to figure out what is the cause of this. Why is God sending this famine upon us? And eventually he figures out it's because Saul had killed these people and basically broken the vow that Israel had made with them to protect them, and instead had come down to killing them. But if you go over in 2 Samuel chapter 21, just kind of give you a little bit of the background here. In verse 2 it says, "So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The children of Israel had sworn protection to them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. Therefore David said to the Gibeonites, 'What shall I do for you? And with what shall I make atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?'" So here again you have this idea of atonement, and what's he asking the Gibeonites here? Yeah, how he can make it right. But the way, and particularly the idea of atonement, is kind of this idea, how can we, cover this up? How can we make this so as you don't look at this anymore and remember that Saul persecuted you? And if you remember the rest of the story, of course they said, "We don't want any gold and silver. We'll take some of the descendants of Saul and put them to death." And that's what they did. So you have this idea of, kind of, what can I do to make things right? What can I do so that you don't see or you don't remember this thing? There's another story where it's used in that manner back in the book of Genesis, the story of Jacob and Esau. Again, this is a story that probably most, not all of you, are going to be familiar with, but we know that Jacob stole Esau's birthright. And remember that he had to run away from his own house because Esau was going to kill him over it. He lived with his uncle for a number of years, labored there, eventually breaks off from his uncle and he starts going back to his homeland. And as he's journeying back, he runs into Esau. And it's interesting, if you remember the story, I'm not going to read all of it, but back in Genesis chapter 32, he starts sending all these presents in front of him. Jacob's plan is to send all these different presents to Esau in different divisions and groups. And then at the very end, Jacob's going to show up and hopefully everything's going to be okay. But if you think about this number, in about verse 14, he gives him 220 goats. He gives him 220 sheep. Think about that number. 30 camels, it says, with their colts, so 60 camels in total. 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 foals. And after all this goes, in verse 20, he says this is what his servants are supposed to say as they're coming to meet Esau with these animals. He says, "Behold, your servant Jacob is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me." Now what's interesting in the original language, this is our word atonement. And literally what Jacob says is, perhaps I will cover his face. That's the idea of atonement. And so if you think about it from Jacob's perspective, what was he wanting to cover from Esau's face? Well, he's wanting to cover what he'd done years ago to Esau. And the way that he was going to do that is by giving him all these different presents, standing in front of Esau to kind of block the view, if you will, or to cover up what he had done in the past. And so it's just kind of interesting, when you think about the idea of atonement, and Lord willing, next week we're going to talk about it more in Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. But it's just kind of interesting from a biblical perspective to go through some of these stories and, to understand exactly what we're trying to accomplish. So when we talk about sin, what is the idea of atonement? What's the goal with sin?
It would just cover. Jesus was the propitiation, which means it satisfied the purpose.
Yeah.
Jesus covered it.
Yeah, and certainly there's a lot of different terms that are used, revolving around the idea of sin. But one of the things, I think that the idea when it comes to sin is when God looks at us, do we want him to see sin? No. No, we don't. We want him to see blood, right? We want him to see forgiveness. And of course, these animal sacrifices were pictures of what Christ would do. So just an idea there. Question number 3 here. So what type of animal from the flock did the Lord require for a burnt offering? Look at verse 10. Somebody read Leviticus 1:10 for us.
His offerings of the flocks, of the sheep or of the goats, as the burnt sacrifice, shall bring a male without blemish.
Okay, so what kind of animal did God require? A male without blemish. And why do you think that was the case?
Best we can be.
Very best that anybody has.
Yeah, the idea, of course, of perfection, of course. Remember, all these things in the Old Testament are just shadows of something greater to come. The greatest sacrifice, who was a male without blemish, was Jesus Christ. And that's really what was typified in I think, this idea. Not all the sacrifices that were required were male, but this one in and of itself was. And so it symbolically, it pointed to Christ and, again, some of his characteristics. When you get over to chapter 2, there's basically 5 major offerings that you read about in the law of Moses. We have the burnt offering, and then you have the grain offering. And what was the purpose of the grain offering? Anybody know? Burnt offering was atonement, right? The grain offering was kind of like a way of showing your thanks to God. We might say a thanksgiving offering even. It was a way of acknowledging that all these blessings, these material, physical blessings that you'd received had come from God, and so you were giving back, some of this that God had given to you. And when you read about these, again, we're not going to go through the whole chapter and hit all the highlights, or hit all the minor details, just the highlights. But go down to verse 11 here in chapter 2, and there were certain ingredients that were not supposed to be present or offered up with a grain offering. Somebody read verse 11 for us.
No meat offering which ye shall bring into the Lord shall be made with leaven, for ye shall burn no leaven, nor any honey, in any offering of the Lord made by fire.
Okay, so 2 ingredients there that were mentioned that weren't supposed to be offered in these grain offerings. What were they? Yeah, leaven and honey. And why do you think that would be? You knew that was coming, right? What does leaven usually symbolize in the scriptures? Yeah, it usually symbolizes something evil or something wicked. It's symbolic of corruption. I remember, or you think in Matthew 16:6, Jesus told his disciples, he said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the scribes. when he wrote the book of Galatians, Galatians 5 and verse 16, he said a little leaven, leaven's the whole lump. In 1 Corinthians 5, remember he's talking about fornication being tolerated among the church. He said, do you not know that a little leaven leavens a whole lump? And so it's the idea of, of wickedness or corruption and how it can spread throughout, of course, the followers of Christ if we're not careful. If you think about yeast or leaven, what does yeast or leaven really do? Well, what is it? Yeah, it's bacteria, isn't it? And so it really sours the dough is what it does. Honey, if you get to it quick enough, it's great, isn't it? What happens if you let honey sit around too long, though? What does the sugar do? Yeah, it ferments, doesn't it? And so you have this idea of, nothing that would taint these offerings. Nothing that would degrade them in any way was to be offered alongside with them. But there was something that was supposed to be offered with every grain offering. Somebody read verse 13 for us.
And every offering of your grain offering you shall season with salt. You should not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt.
Okay, so salt was obviously something that was supposed to be offered with every grain offering. And how does salt differ from leaven?
It doesn't change the purpose.
Okay? Yeah, it's a preservative, isn't it? It preserves, it keeps something intact versus leaven, or, that degrades or infects things. And so it's interesting, in the New Testament, Jesus compares his followers. Matthew 5:13, you're the salt of the earth. Galatians chapter 4, he talks about our speech. How is it supposed to be seasoned? With salt, right? So it's this idea of preservation. It's this idea of keeping. And, I think in all these offerings, there was this reminder, nothing was to be corrupted in any way. Nothing was to be affected in an evil or corrupt way, but the job of the people was to keep the covenant, was to preserve that covenant with God. And I think these were just, put into place to kind of remind them of these duties that God had given to them. When you get over into chapter 3, the third offering, major offering that you read about in the Old Testament is the peace offering. And what was the thought behind the peace offering? Do you know? Yeah, it was a little bit more than a reconciliation. I think probably it was more the idea of fellowship. Because when it came to the peace offering, I know it's not mentioned here specifically in chapter 3, but when you get over into chapter 7, who all ate of the peace offering? You remember? Yeah, God got part of it, the priest got part of it, the guy who offered it, he got part of it too. And so it was this idea of everybody sharing something in common. The idea of, we might say the idea of even fellowship today. And so it was through this peace offering that everybody was brought together to have something in common. When you read about it in verses 6 and 7 here, what type of lamb was supposed to be presented to the Lord? Somebody want to read chapter 3 here, verse 6 and 7?
But if his offering for a sacrifice, a peace offering to the Lord is from the flock, he shall offer it male or female without defect. If he's going to offer a male for his offering, then he shall offer it before the Lord.
Okay, so what particularly was important about this offering? Did it matter if it was male or female? No? Yeah. The only thing that mattered was it could not have any kind of blemish. There were no defects that were supposed to be in any of these animals. When you think about peace, the idea of peace, how do we get peace? Why do we have peace as Christians?
We have the satisfaction of knowing that we are forgiven of our sins.
Yeah, ultimately it has to do with our relationship with God, doesn't it? Like you said, that involves a lot of things. It involves sin, it involves forgiveness, it involves heaven. But ultimately, without having a relationship with God, we can't have the true peace that the Bible speaks about. And so it was by offering this animal that a person had fellowship with God, had fellowship with one another. Priests shared in it, God shared in it, the offerer himself shared in it too. And of course, that sacrifice, was symbolic of Christ, wasn't it? All of us are brought together. He brought man and God into fellowship, and we're in fellowship with one another because of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And so it's only through that sacrifice that they had shared that fellowship with one another. It's only through the sacrifice of Christ that we have fellowship with God, fellowship with one another, peace with God, and peace with one another. What part of this offering belonged to the Lord? Somebody read verse 16.
And the priest shall burn them upon the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire for a sweet savor. All the fat is the Lord's.
Anybody miss that? What part belonged to God? How much of it? Yeah, all of it. You think about, in these different offerings, God had the right to demand every bit of all of it, didn't he? I mean, he could have claimed all of it as his own. But instead, there were certain parts in these offerings, except for the burnt offering, that he laid claim to. And in the peace offering, it had to do with the fat. Now, it's interesting to us, sometimes I know people are repulsed by fat. Fat wasn't just for eating back then. That wasn't why they used it. But there were a lot of different uses, in common day life that people had for fat. It's very valuable in and of itself. And so I think part of the sacrifice, the most valuable part, would have been the fat. And that's what was given to God. It's interesting when you go back and you read about the word, or even use the word fat in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 45, you'll read about Joseph. Remember, he went down into Egypt. He interpreted Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh told him after his brothers came and it was known throughout all Egypt, Pharaoh told him to come and live in his land, and he said, eat the fat of the land. Well, what was he talking about? Yeah, the best, right? That's the idea of how it's used in the Bible. And so the best of this offering belonged to God. But the priest also got part of it. The Israelite, the person who was offering, also took part in it too. Question number 10 here. So the Israelites were commanded not to eat what parts of this peace or fellowship offering? Somebody read verse 17.
This shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations. In all your dwellings you shall eat neither fat nor blood.
Okay, so no fat. The fat belonged to God. Of course, good principle there. Should we take what belongs to God for ourselves? Better not, have we? All the fat belonged to God. So none of the Israelites in this peace offering were allowed to take of the fat. And then, of course, you have the idea of blood. That's just kind of a universal principle. The life is in the blood. You could go into pretty detailed discussion about that, but I only know of one instance in the Bible, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I only know of one instance in the Bible where the idea of eating these things with the blood is mentioned. And that's remember the vow that Saul made, had his whole army make whenever he was fighting the Philistines. He said, nobody eats anything until the enemy of God is destroyed. And the Bible says the guys were just starving, by the time they fought all day long, and they ran upon the spoils, they ran upon the animals, and they started eating them with the blood mingled with it. And then, the people started talking about, well, they're sinning. You know, they're doing what God had forbidden. I think that's the only example that I can think of in the Bible where it's particularly called into view. And so remember, Saul sets up this big stone, and then the animals are killed on that stone, which lets some of that blood drain out of them rather than just grabbing a hold of it and starting eating it with it laying in the blood. And I think that's really what was being spoken of there. You know, any amount of meat, doesn't matter what you eat, it's going to contain some blood. It doesn't matter even if you cook it. It may be cooked blood, but it's still going to contain some part. It's impossible to drain every drop of blood out of the meat. So, you know, I think the idea that was being spoken of here is the idea where you don't just disrespect blood and life, just throw it in like it's nothing. You know, you drain it, you do what you can to prepare the meat to separate it. And again, I think that 1 Samuel 14 kind of illustrates that. In chapters 4 and 5, we have the sin offering and the trespass offering. And in question 11 here, we're not going to read all these, but if you look at them, what type of sins are addressed in that section?
Ignorance.
Yeah, King James Version translates it as ignorance. The New King James Version translates it as unintentionally. It's kind of interesting. It's the same word that's used for the city of refuge, where, remember, if somebody killed somebody else accidentally, then they could flee there. Well, that's the same word. It's the unintentional killing of somebody. It wasn't it's the idea of ignorance. You didn't know you killed somebody. It's just that you didn't intend to kill anybody. And, you know, when you think about sin, you know, obviously there are times when we don't set out to sin. That's not our goal, but we wind up sinning. Sometimes people set out to sin, right? Some people are dead set, you know, I'm going to go do this, and I'm going to break this law of God, and I'm going to break this law of God. Other times we might go throughout our day and we might encounter something. We didn't intend to do this, you know, we didn't set it up, we didn't plan it for the day, but we end up violating God's law. So that's the type of sins. It's addressed to persons. In verse 13, the whole congregation is mentioned there. Verse 22, a ruler. Verse 27, the common people. So it basically covers the different sacrifices that were required in those situations. And basically, you know, an offering had to be made for a person to be forgiven. Question 12 here. So what did a person have to do when he or she discovered they had sinned? Two things. Chapter 5 there, verses 5 and 6.
Confess.
Yeah, the first thing is you have to confess you're guilty, right? I've sinned. I've violated God's law. What was the second thing?
Bring it unto the Lord.
Yeah, you had to offer something, didn't you? You had to offer something in order for that sin to be forgiven. So confession and offering were required for the forgiveness of sin. You get into chapter 5 and verse 14 through chapter 6 and verse 7. It deals with some of the violations, the sins that required restitution to go along with them. You had sins against holy things that were of God. You had sins that were against your fellow men. And basically in verse 13, you have a principle here. What happened to these people who sinned, even though they didn't know the Lord's commandments? What was their situation?
Somebody still had to make it.
Yeah, if you look at verse 17, it says, if a person sins and commits any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he does not know it, yet he is guilty, and shall bear his iniquity. He shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish from the flock, with your valuation as a trespass offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him regarding his ignorance in which he erred and did not know it, and it shall be forgiven him. You know, you have this idea, one of the things that's kicked around in the religious world a lot is, well, what about people who don't know? And I think part of what we fail to understand is the definition of sin. What is the definition of sin?
Trespass God.
It's a breaking a commandment of God, right? Does it have anything to do with the knowledge of the person? No. I mean, can I sin even though I don't know it?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it has nothing to do, sin isn't based upon my knowledge. Sin is based upon God's law. And so whenever God's law is broken, whether I know it or not, is it sin? Yeah, I mean, it's no different than the laws of the land. You know, we could have a law in effect today, and you know, an officer could pull me over or something and say, well, you broke this law. And I said, well, I didn't know that was a law. Well, am I guilty or not? I'm guilty because the law's there, isn't it? And I think that's what sometimes people fail to understand in the definition of sin. God's law is there. And you know, whether a person knows it or not, if they break it, it's sin, isn't it? And that's what's being said here. And I think the point that maybe should be made here in this idea of offering, it's not to take sin lightly. Now, it's not like a person say, well, I didn't know, I don't have to offer an animal. You know, ignorance. Nothing needs to be done because I wasn't knowledgeable enough to know. Well, God said you got to offer the offering, don't you? It has to be done because it's sin. And in order to take away sin, you got to have the sacrifice for the offering made. There were certain properties that required restitution plus 20% interest. Special duties of priest. Like I said, we got 8 chapters here. We didn't even start to touch the hymn. But if you read chapter 10, I think all of us know the story of Nadab and Abihu. You know, in the first few chapters, you have this idea of the right way to worship God. You know, here's what you need to do. Here's what you have to do. Chapter 10, you have the wrong way. And Nadab and Abihu didn't do it God's way. And when we don't do things God's way, what happens? We don't get the desired outcome, do we? And so that's the great lesson, I think, to take away from Nadab and Abihu and really the first few chapters here in the book of Leviticus. I know we had to blaze through it quickly. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions?